Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Stalking the Great Killer, Arkansas's Long War on Tuberculosis, by Larry C. Floyd. Contributions by Joseph H. Bates. Narrated by David Colacci. Preface. Nearly 6,000 Arkansans died from the COVID-19 virus in the first 12 months of this lethal pandemic, from April 2020 through March 2021. The deadly illness reminds us of the power of natural forces impervious to modern science, and of our vulnerability in the face of newly emerging disease. Even in the age of space travel, instant communication, and unparalleled affluence, we live in a world of nature indifferent to our progress, our needs, and our desires. Imagine a time in Arkansas when a hidden killer took lives at a rate equal to or greater than COVID-19 in 2020 and 2021, and continued this grim harvest year after year, decade after decade, throughout the 19th century and far into the 20th. During many of the years in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, tuberculosis took the lives of some 3,000 Arkansans, at a time when the state's population was about 1/3 its present number. This was the scourge of tuberculosis, a menace endemic to much of society in Arkansas and the rest of the nation. Tenacious and far beyond a passing pandemic, the great killer has killed more in the United States and the world than any disease in history. Most of us today are unaware of how this feared disease so affected the recent past, but many of the generation born before 1940 still remember this insidious terror that stalked the land. For them, the term consumption, the form of tuberculosis that ravaged its victims' lungs, conjures vivid memories of blood-stained handkerchiefs, helpless invalids, and wasted lives. Tragically, tuberculosis usually struck down those in the prime of life, devastating families and careers. Mercifully, the horrors of tuberculosis, although not eradicated, were largely subdued by modern science in the 20th century. We live at a time when most take for granted this miracle of modern science, but this advancement is a relatively recent phenomenon. A little more than a century ago, medical practice was only marginally improved over treatments in ancient Greece. Early in the 20th century, the telephone and the automobile symbolized the progress of a modern era, but lack of advancement in the medical world led some at the time to call medicine the withered arm of science. Successful treatment of tuberculosis in the United States and in Arkansas paralleled the extraordinary progress in public health and medical science in the 20th century. Recounting these incremental medical advances that ended the great killer's reign of terror, and that of many other diseases, provides meaningful instruction in how medical science, social groups, and community leaders mobilize society, assimilate new knowledge, and adopt innovations. The lessons from these developments can be both enlightening and inspirational. Along these same lines, Arkansas owes its hard-won success against tuberculosis not just to advances in medical science, but also to the dedicated medical professionals, community leaders, and private volunteers who incorporated medical progress into programs and treatments. In the 20th century, civic-minded Arkansans developed much of the state's healthcare system in response to the scourge of tuberculosis. Recent generations of Arkansans can learn much from the efforts and sacrifices of those who led these efforts. Much of this narrative is intended to recognize the contributions of those leaders, known and obscure, in the state's long war on tuberculosis. The rate of infection and mortality in Arkansas was far higher than most U.S. states, so the effects of the disease and efforts to combat it were more dramatic. Following advances in drug therapy and its proper use, the state became a model for the nation in the treatment of tuberculosis in the second half of the 20th century. Stalking the Great Killer, Arkansas's Long War on Tuberculosis, chronicles this struggle and the innovations and state leaders that led to the victory over this stubborn and deadly menace. This book is largely a narrative history based on published materials and interviews. Arkansas native Dr. Joseph H. Bates provided keen insight for this narrative from his more than half a century as a witness and active participant in the fight against the age-old plague of tuberculosis. Prologue. Sanatorium Hill, time has not silenced your heartbeat. You will ever hold the spirit of those who came to your outstretched arms. You held them in your bosom. You were a haven of hope, yet merciless. From the poem Sanatorium Hill by Jo Bell Skrillo, in memory of her mother, Mamie Thomas, who died in 1937 at the Arkansas State Tuberculosis Sanatorium. Darkness lingered outside his bedroom window as Joe Bates dressed in the pre-dawn of a summer day. It was just before his senior year at Little Rock Central High School. A long, difficult day lay ahead, and he needed an early start. Days earlier, Joe's parents had assigned him a grim task. He was to drive the family's late-model Mercury automobile to the small southern Arkansas town of Waldo. There he would pick up his 34-year-old uncle, Harry Wallace, and transport him to the Arkansas State Tuberculosis Sanatorium outside Boonville in the northwest corner of the state. Harry had recently been diagnosed with pulmonary tuberculosis, commonly known as consumption, for its body-consuming characteristics. He was one more in a sad procession of Arkansas tuberculosis sufferers that summer in 1949, and another in a much longer parade dating back to statehood. Looking back more than a half-century later, Joe would question the appropriateness of a high schooler being given this responsibility. At the time, though, he didn't think much about it. He just considered it another chore, like the many required of him, around his rural home near the small community of Sweet Home, just southeast of Little Rock. Harboring the Arkansas Confederate Soldiers' Home, the Sweet Home community had provided a Norman Rockwell childhood for the youth. He had explored a few of the blue holes left from the abandoned bauxite mines in the area, and frequently passed by the landmark Hanger Cotton Gin without giving it much thought. The old gin would later be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. Athletic and handsome, with a shock of thick, dark hair, the youth had been driving his Cushman motor scooter to high school in Little Rock for several years. He had made the varsity football team as a fullback at a time when Central High numbered more than 2,000 students, and the Tigers fielded a fearsome squad. Outside athletics, he excelled in the classroom and would graduate high school before he turned 17. Joe worked that summer driving a box truck for Terry Dairy Products. 5 days a week he delivered milk to the Veterans Administration Mental Institution in North Little Rock, navigating the city's traffic to the facility that housed many of the shattered minds still recovering from the horrors of 2 world wars. Bright and dependable, the youth must have seemed to his parents quite capable of transporting his uncle to the care that awaited at the sprawling state sanatorium for tuberculosis patients. With little fanfare, Joe said goodbye to his mother that summer morning, assuring her that he would see that her youngest brother would be in the facility before the day was over. Daylight streaked the sky as Joe traveled west across the back road south of Little Rock to reach U.S. Highway 70. From there, he drove southwesterly to U.S. 67 in Benton, then on through Malvern and Arkadelphia to the town of Prescott. Here the road got rough as he traversed the poorly maintained gravel surface on State Highway 19. The occasional run-down farmhouse that he passed displayed the poverty and attendant poor health and hygiene prevalent in many parts of rural Arkansas just after World War II. Although Joe would not have made the connection at the time, the same poverty he drove past that hot summer day was intertwined with his Uncle Harry's illness. State health officials who battled tuberculosis at the time often called it a disease of poverty, a reference to the high correlation between the prevalence of this scourge and the malnourishment, crowded households, and poor hygiene that promoted it. Still, this infectious disease spread throughout the state's affluent and poor alike. Along with a number of other southern agricultural states, Arkansas had struggled economically for decades after the Civil War, suffering from low crop prices and lack of industrial development. The new century had brought little relief to the poor families in towns and rural areas. The nation's agricultural downturn of the 1920s and the Great Depression of the 1930s had only exacerbated the state's financial problems and related health issues. World War II had promoted economic activity and raised the standard of living to a degree, but tuberculosis still stalked Arkansas, killing thousands each year. The state consistently ranked among the nation's worst annually in rate of mortality from the disease, and more than half of the cases were already infectious when diagnosed. 2/3 of those suffering and dying were between the ages of 15 and 35, depriving the state of needed workers, separating fathers and mothers from their families, and tearing children from their parents. Continuing his drive southward on State Highway 19 to Waldo, Joe saw small communities and more pockets of poverty in southern Arkansas as he entered the southern coastal plain, which extended southward through Louisiana to the Gulf of Mexico. Not far into Columbia County, the Waldo Water Tower rose high on the horizon. A New Deal-era product of the Public Works Administration, the tower project had greatly improved the town's water supply, another of the state's health concerns well into the 20th century. Home to 1,500 in 1949, Waldo was where Joe's uncle lived with his wife and 3 young sons. It had been the destination of numerous childhood visits by Joe and his mother. He drove straight to his Uncle Harry's small house on the same block where Harry's mother and sister lived. His early start had put him in Waldo by mid-morning. Despite their age difference, Harry had always been special to Joe, 18 years junior to his uncle. Of average height and thin build, the brown-haired Harry worked as a mechanic at his father-in-law's gasoline and service station. Little time was spent on greetings and farewells. The trip to the sanatorium would take several hours, and Joe would still have the drive back to Sweet Home. Harry's wife, Mary Helen, and their 3 young boys lined up in the driveway to wave a tearful farewell. The painful scene would stay with Joe the rest of his life. He remembers his uncle, whom he had always looked up to, crying as they drove away from Harry's young family. The distraught tuberculosis sufferer worried aloud about how his family would survive without his earnings. They were poor, but at a time when many in the state were unaware of their poverty, with those around them little or no better off. Unsure if or when he would return from the sanatorium, Harry questioned aloud whether his wife would wait for him. It was difficult for Joe to hear his uncle's distress. Although this memory was personal to Joe Bates, the rending of families had been a too familiar event throughout Arkansas for many decades. Every year the sanatorium took in hundreds of men and women, mostly in their prime, like Harry Wallace. By 1949, the facility had more than 1,000 beds restricted to Arkansas residents, all facing the terror and uncertainty of tuberculosis, the Great White Plague, the greatest killer in world history. About half of these sanatorium residents were expected to die within a few years, and many of the fortunate survivors faced financial ruin and broken families. Nephew and uncle drove westward from Waldo on U.S. Highway 82 to Texarkana, then onto U.S. 71 north to DeQueen. It was hot, and the car had no air conditioning. They stopped at a nondescript diner for lunch. Forlorn, Harry downed a couple of beers with his meal. By mid-afternoon they were past Mena and turning onto the gravel of State Highway 23, just 12 miles from the sanatorium. Their state road map identified their destination as State Sanatorium, a self-contained community with its own post office. About 3 miles south of Boonville, they turned east and up a steep road. A dozen miles or so to the east, the high ridges around Mount Magazine rose above the dark green vista. As they drove through the foreboding stone entrance to the sanatorium, an entire town came into view. Water towers, numerous white brick buildings, individual houses, a movie theater, and even a dairy. The sprawling institution encompassed some 900 acres on what had been Potts Ridge, known locally as the Hill. Area residents would continue to use this moniker for the institution, as well as the San. The site of this asylum for tuberculosis sufferers had been selected in 1908. Construction of buildings and infrastructure began the following year and had never ceased. Unfortunately for Arkansas, treatment of tuberculosis continued to be a growth industry in the 1940s. The setting for this medical facility had been chosen for its high ground and fresh mountain air, considered key in the treatment of pulmonary tuberculosis. The newcomers stopped at the Art Deco Administration Building for directions to the Nyberg Building, where Harry Wallace would be admitted. The Nyberg Building was a massive 5-story treatment facility and dormitory, built in the same white brick Art Deco style as the Administration Building and several other large structures on the grounds. The largest Depression-era Public Works Administration project in the state, it was dedicated in 1940 and named for Leo E. Nyberg, a state representative from Phillips County. The complex was known worldwide as one of the most modern and successful, relatively speaking, tuberculosis treatment facilities. A tuberculosis victim himself, Representative Nyberg had fought hard for state funding of this treatment facility and would die at the sanatorium before his namesake building was fully completed in 1941. The building and expansion program from the funding Nyberg had championed made the institution the largest state tuberculosis sanatorium in the nation, a dubious distinction for Arkansas with its desperate need for the 1,000-plus beds. Another building on the sanatorium grounds, Chi Oldham Hall, bore the name of an earlier state leader. A state senator from Pulaski County, and desperately ill with tuberculosis, Oldham had introduced the bill in the state Senate to establish the sanatorium. The legislator worked diligently with former Arkansas Chief Justice Joseph M. Hill and Little Rock physician C.P. Merriweather, both tuberculosis sufferers, to galvanize statewide support for the sanatorium. Hill's infirmity had forced his resignation from the Arkansas Supreme Court, and Oldham would succumb to the disease 2 years after the first patient was admitted in 1909. Carrying the one suitcase and the few personal items allowed, Joe and his Uncle Harry walked up the steep steps and through the impressive entrance to the Nyberg Building. Hundreds of patients were housed there. The admissions workers began processing Harry. He would soon be isolated from family and friends, another tubercular patient starting the long regimen of rest and treatment that would hopefully cure him, or at least arrest the disease and allow him to return to his family in the outside world. "I'll see you soon, Joe," Harry said, putting on as brave a face as he could muster. He told his nephew he probably would not be staying long in the sanatorium. As his uncle was still being admitted, Joe left the sanatorium and drove down the steep road that connected the hill to the outside world. Driving east on State Highway 10, he thought of his return to his comfortable house in Sweet Home, of soon starting his senior year in high school, of playing football for Central High on cool fall nights. Seemingly in a parallel universe, the uncle he so esteemed would be battling a life-threatening disease away from home and his family. New tuberculosis infections in Arkansas had declined significantly since the establishment of the large institution in 1909, one of 700 such sanatoria across the United States by 1938. Additionally, in 1930, a still segregated Arkansas had opened the 25-bed Thomas McRae Sanatorium for Negroes in Alexander, not far from Little Rock. The McRae facility would be enlarged to 200 beds by 1940, but still with a waiting list of more than 650. The hard-hit black community in Arkansas would continue to suffer a much higher death rate from tuberculosis than white residents. Despite efforts by the Arkansas medical community, the annual tuberculosis death rate in the 1950s remained alarmingly high at around 32 per 100,000. Sanatoria throughout the nation and the world had a disappointing record of failing to arrest tuberculosis, and a death rate for these patients around 50%. These institutions did, however, provide a service of reducing the spread of the disease through isolation of the infected. As the sanatorium movement peaked, medical science continued its march. After more than a half-century of alleged cures for the great killer of mankind, the miracle was finally at hand as Harry Wallace was admitted to the Hill that summer in 1949. Just the year before, in an April 1948 edition of the Arkansas Gazette, a column by a physician reported that the new drug streptomycin offered greater hope than any other tuberculosis treatment in the past. In February 1949, the Gazette reported in another article by the same physician another new drug with treatment potential against tuberculosis, para-aminosalicylic acid, more commonly called PAS by medical researchers. Cautiously, the column went on to say that uses of both streptomycin and PAS to fight tuberculosis might not be the answer, but the plan is a step in the right direction. Both articles were printed on the Gazette's opinion page. Many decades of claimed cures for the scourge of tuberculosis had proved spurious, so most in the medical community looked askance at newly announced treatments. Such reports about cures for tuberculosis were generally treated more as opinions than medical fact. But the long-sought miracle cure for the Leviathan of death was on the horizon, whether the public or the medical community yet recognized it. Shortly after Harry Wallace first entered the state sanatorium near Boonville, another startling breakthrough was reported in the Gazette on November 13, 1949. Significantly, this article appeared as a syndicated news story and not on the opinion page. It told of a new, even more effective synthetic drug to fight tuberculosis. From the family of chemically derived thiosemicarbazones, Contibin had been formulated by German Dr. Gerhard Domach, winner of the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1939 for his development of sulfa drugs. Continuing his research in the renowned Bayer laboratories, Domach would again startle the world in the early 1950s with his announcement of wondrous results from treating tuberculosis with hydrazine. Later known as isoniazid, it was also derived from the thiosemicarbazone family. The new drug would be considered by many, somewhat prematurely but not altogether wrong, the holy grail of tuberculosis drug therapy. Although great men of medical science had finally developed effective drugs to fight the scourge of tuberculosis, much still lay ahead in the education of the public and the use of the new drug therapies. From scientific minds, modern laboratories, and studies on several continents, these medical discoveries would trickle down to Arkansas. A new generation of physicians and health workers would continue the battle in the second half of the 20th century, aiding the state in its long war on the dreaded disease of tuberculosis. Joe Bates had no inkling he would be one of that new generation of medical warriors as he drove eastward along State Highway 10 toward Sweet Home that late summer evening in 1949. Arriving at his home on that long day, he was greeted by his parents as he entered. He reported that all had gone well and recounted the day's events. A former schoolteacher who encouraged her son's academic pursuits and his nascent plans to become a medical doctor, his mother listened closely. Joe intentionally omitted Harry's drinking those 2 beers at their lunch stop. His mother was a teetotaler and would not have approved. The youth soon retired to his bedroom, weary from the day's events that would stay with him for the rest of his life. Chapter 1. A World of Death and Darkness. It is evident that, at times, certain atmospheric conditions contain exhalations from the soil, and certain electrical states concur, and form an epidemic constitution, through which agency a morbid poison propagates itself with unusual rapidity and intensity. Early Arkansas physician A.W. Webb, in his treatise, Medical Notes and Reflections, 1844. As grim and unhopeful as Harry Wallace's admission to the state sanatorium seemed to him and many other tuberculosis victims at the time, this confinement represented a major advancement in medical treatment. Tragically, until late in the 1940s, these sequestrations would be the most significant treatment for the great killer in its long history. And the disease indeed had a lengthy history, along with a staggering harvest of as many as 1 billion human lives. Although the disease commonly brings to mind a lethal attack on the victim's lungs, the chronic cough, the bloody sputum, the wasting away of flesh, pulmonary tuberculosis is just one form of the disease. This destructive illness can occur outside the lungs, and all body organs are fair game to its depredations. Tuberculosis of the lymph glands, or scrofula, often manifests as ugly, discolored lesions along the side of the sufferer's neck. Severe infections of the spine can result in deformity, causing a hunchback on the victim. Medical evidence on the disease in humans dates back to the Stone Age. The 7,000-year-old grave of a young male found near Heidelberg, Germany, shows the telltale sign in 2 deformed vertebrae. Found in a cave near Liguria, Italy, the remains of a teenaged boy from around 4000 B.C. bear signs of even more serious damage to the spine. Similar evidence of tuberculosis in graves from this period have been found in Denmark and the valley of the Jordan River. Egyptian mummies around 4000 B.C. provide even clearer evidence of the ancient roots of tuberculosis. Several of these preserved corpses display revealing damage to the spinal column. The track of pus oozing from the diseased spine of a mummified high priest may be the most distinct indication of this scourge from antiquity. The malady's manifestations in Egyptian society are displayed in drawings of hunchbacked figures on the walls of tombs, perhaps the first, but certainly not the last, of the influence of tuberculosis on art and literature. The Old Testament books of Leviticus and Deuteronomy describe a tuberculosis-like disease that plagued the Israelites, which they named shachefeth. The ancient Hebrew word for the wasting disease appears linked to the later derivative, shachefet, the modern Hebrew term for tuberculosis. The writings of Hippocrates describe the ancient Greeks suffering from a wasting and hemorrhaging from the lungs, which they called phthisis. The word was derived from the earlier term thynine, a general word for waning health or wasting away. The Hippocratic writings include a description of the first kind of phthisis, an excess of phlegm in the lungs, choking and difficulty breathing, and eventual closing of the respiratory passage, followed by death. Much as did the bloodletting treatments prescribed by the ancient Greeks, over the subsequent 2 millennia, the term phthisis survived as the medical term for what would later be called consumption. The first indicator of tuberculosis in England can be found in graves that date from the Roman occupation. Later, with Europeans' acceptance of their monarch's divine right to rule, came a belief that they had the power to heal disease, a conviction these rulers were sometimes eager to promote. In the 11th century, Edward the Confessor was reported to have laid his healing hands on the unsightly scrofula lesions of a young married woman who had been unable to bear children. Not only did his royal
Sample complete. Ready to continue?